Hello and welcome to the final chapter in the series of the Spanish Civil War. If you have missed previous parts, I recommend you look at those before you get spoiled. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy. Now that Franco had given the orders for the final major offensive to be launched, it was expected that there was going to be heavy fighting. Instead, when the Nationalists marched across the front lines on the 26th of March, they encountered no resistance, instead seeing empty posts. The Condor Legion conducted several bombing runs, but they noticed that the positions they were bombarding were deserted. It was at this moment that they realized the Republic had surrendered. Wherever they went, disheveled Republican troops lay down their arms. Some were captured and imprisoned, and others simply walked home. By the 31st of March, all of Spain had been covered by this unopposed advance, and Franco, along with the rest of the Nationalist supporters, declared victory for the Nationalist Spain. And like that, the Spanish Civil War, after 2 years and 9 months of fighting, after over 500,000 losing their lives, was over. A massive victory parade was held in Madrid a month later, where up to 120,000 men took part, along with an airshow by the Condor Legion. The nation was reunited under the absolute rule of their new caudillo, Francisco Franco, a man with many ambitions. And by ambitions, I mean conducting a massive purge of the undesirable political elements and rebuilding the nation at any cost. The country had been reduced to a terrible state during the war, with a massive number of buildings destroyed and its infrastructure obliterated. Spain also owed a massive amount of debt to Germany and Italy for war aid, which meant that a drastic fix was needed. Over the 1940s, Spain would see a level of political repression that would make the Inquisition look benign by comparison. To begin with, Franco needed to consolidate his authority, which meant pleasing the many people who were loyal to him. This meant giving out a number of cushy, well-paying positions to his cronies, who would in turn surrender their influence to him alone. This allowed him to fully cement his position on the 8th of August, creating a new government with him as the head, and most of the underlings being a nationalist military command. All the land that had been seized by the radicals in the Republican zone was given back to the aristocrats, reversing any land reform made previously. Spain would slowly evolve, or devolve depending on how you look at it, into some sort of semi-feudal theocratic autocracy with an entrenched hierarchy of elites of the old regime still in power. The only difference now is that it was a technocratic military junta which sought to regulate and control every aspect of society. The economy was regulated under the model of autarky, which aimed for self-sufficiency and reducing trade and interaction with the outside world. It also meant heavy government intervention in trade, as prices for many commodities were fixed, and worker wages were kept as low as possible. These policies did not do wonders for national development, as it fostered an environment of massive corruption and endless bureaucracy. Of course, how could we possibly forget about the political repression that went on in the country during these years? The Franquist elite were highly concerned about foreign infiltration corrupting the fabric of Spanish society, and many were convinced that the only way to rid the virus of Bolshevism was with a thorough and ruthless cleansing. This meant setting up a massive system of prison camps to intern up to as many as 500,000 people. The conditions in many of these places was appalling, to say the least, and the inmates would face back-breaking labor on construction projects. A whole number of repressive laws were passed, which were intended to exact revenge against the crimes committed in the Republican zone. These included severe punishments to any who blasphemed against the Catholic Church, spoke any language other than Spanish, or who were believed to be Freemasons, a highly suspected group. It is still debated as to how many were killed in the post-war White Terror, but estimates vary from anywhere being 50,000 to 200,000 deaths as a direct result of executions or being worked to death in labor camps. One of the most sinister things that occurred was the spurious classification of left-wing views as a mental illness. Some were convinced that Bolshevism was a disorder and should be treated as such. As a result, many communist sympathizers were rounded up and put into psychiatric centers to be cured. This also meant that the children of the parents who were suspicious would be abducted and educated in nationalist values. While this may be a bit of an exaggeration, it is not entirely inappropriate to refer to Franquist Spain during the 1940s as an open-air prison for anyone who did not sympathize with the regime. Whilst he was dragging his country back to the pre-Enlightenment era, Franco knew that he still had massive debts to pay Hitler and Mussolini, which meant revitalizing the economy and rebuilding Spain. This began with the building of numerous infrastructure projects such as railways and hydroelectric dams, along with the ordering of reconstruction of areas damaged during the war. Spain would remain neutral during World War II, as Franco had declared right after the German invasion of Poland, believing that he should focus on rebuilding Spain before fighting. However, they did still support the Axis for a few years. Franco even once offered to join the war during the Battle of Britain and take British territory of Gibraltar, on the condition that vast territories in Africa be given to Spain, but nothing came of the deal. Arguably, the closest Spain came to officially participating in the war was with the Volunteer Blue Division, which fought alongside the Germans in the invasion of the Soviet Union. However, it was a force of roughly 40,000 men, a mere drop in the ocean when you consider the millions of troops who were fighting on the Eastern Front. Hitler and Franco's relationship would constantly deteriorate over the coming years. They both started to despise each other in meetings they held, causing many rifts to form in the relationship between Nazi Germany and Franquist Spain. As Franco observed the tide of the war beginning to turn in the Allies' favour, he increasingly distanced himself from the Axis. By early 1944 he had severed all ties with the Germans and ended all trade relations with them. Instead, Franco began to pivot to the Allies, specifically the Western ones, by leaning on the anti-communist sentiment which was developing. This meant that Spain would never be invaded by the Allies, and that Franco would be able to retain his grip on the country as a stooge against communism during the Cold War. In the years after World War II, Franco began to slowly loosen his draconian edicts. Because of Franco's economic policies of autarky, Spain had neared financial ruin in the late 40s. At first, the world was cautious to have anything to do with the fascist regime that had been so close to the Axis, but eventually, the country retreated from isolation and became closer to the Western Allies, specifically the United States, even allowing the construction of a pair of military bases on its soil. International trade was no longer forbidden, which increased the commerce between the United States and, strangely enough, Argentina, which, under the rule of Juan Perón, was a supporter of Franco. Most sanctions on Spain would be lifted in the early 1950s, and the country was even allowed to join the United Nations, although not become a member nation. Franco would rule Spain for 3 more decades until he started to become old and grey, which is when he realized that he needed to transition the country to a political system which could survive without him. By the 1970s, whilst Spain was a member of the international community, it was still considered to be a strange, fascist regime that had survived World War II and was still heavily scrutinized. Human rights activists constantly criticized the nation and its repressive policies. Europe never considered it to be a part of the wider European community, and a sort of renewed isolation had begun to seep in. Franco decided that some form of democracy was required if Spain was going to get into the modern age. So he settled on the next best thing, constitutional monarchy. The dictator was able to get the grandson of the last monarch of Spain, Alfonso XIII, Juan Carlos, to be his successor. Franco would die on the 19th of November of 1975, and King Carlos would be crowned soon afterwards. Spain's political transition would be rocky, but in time Carlos was able to get a constitution and free elections for the country and establish the Cortes. Even afterwards, though, it wasn't smooth sailing, as Spain would suffer a coup in 1981 after a bout of economic instability and civil unrest. The attempt failed, but it still has left quite a mark on the Spanish psyche. Today, the Spanish Civil War is rarely ever discussed, even in the very country in which it happened. It is generally seen as an ugly stain on the nation's history which didn't do any good, and one which its inhabitants would rather forget about. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Civil War can still be felt. Arguably, the most important monument to the conflict is the Basilica in the Valley of the Fallen, in which the victims of the war are remembered. Controversially, it is where Franco was buried, however he was removed in 2019. Spain is a nation which still suffers from a number of problems which many have argued can be traced back to the dark days of Franquist rule, be that its corrupt political structure, its crappy public sector, or the constant outbreaks of separatist movements. The country has definitely fallen a real long way from the good old days of the Empire, but hey, it's still a unique place with many things worth seeing. This has been Basil Draffin, and thanks for watching.